Hi everybody, and welcome to Smart Talk, the Henry George School of Social Sciences video interview series with leading economic thinkers. My name is Alan Tonelson. I'm a trustee of the Henry George School, and I'm the founder of the Reality Check blog, which covers economic and national security issues. And this month, we're especially pleased to welcome as our guest Dr. Robin Gaster, who's going to be speaking about a subject that's very dear to the heart of probably everybody who's got to work for a living, and that is, will the robots and the new technologies be taking all of our jobs? And Robin is going to explain in today's Smart Talk why this time, even though perhaps in previous eras of technological change we've seen net job gains, this time it's different, Robin says, and he's uniquely qualified to comment on these questions. He is currently the founder of a very successful and well-known economic consulting firm, I should say economic and technology consulting firm, Incumetrics, and his clients include many government agencies, both in the United States and also Europe. Robin holds a PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. His previous positions have included technology analyst at Congress's former Office of Technology Assessment. He is, again, uniquely qualified to talk about this mega issue of the impact of new technologies on the American labor market, on the global labor market, and we're very pleased to have him as our guest on this month's edition of Smart Talk. Robin, welcome to the Henry George School and welcome to Smart Talk. And I'm so glad that we were able to schedule this interview because the question of the impact of new technologies, automation broadly speaking, on the American jobs market, on the world jobs market, is really just about on everybody's lips. And I know that you're going to be able to offer some especially valuable insights here, and in fact, even groundbreaking insights. But let's start off with a question that's been bugging me for many, many months now, and that is, where did you get the name for your company, Incumetrics?
So I've been working on innovation and innovation policy for a very long time. And really, from a policy perspective, this is sort of about incubating innovation. How do you get small companies to be more successful? How do you grow more Googles? How do you, well, you may not want to grow more Googles now, but nonetheless, how do you move from the lab all the way to the market and then on into rapid growth? And so that's really, I see that as the government's job is to foster the conditions that make that easier. So that's the incubation part. And I'm kind of a data-driven guy. I like data, and I think data helps us to make smart choices. So metrics. So you know, a current project is to try and use census data to try and measure outcomes for certain programs. That's the kind of thing that I'm thinking will be important as we go forward.
And I know that you've managed to obtain access to a lot of very detailed census data that's normally not available to the general public. And I also know that a lot of this highly specialized data has been central to your research into this mega issue of the effect of new technologies on the employment market. So I'm really looking forward to finding out about some of your major findings. But let's sort of start from 30,000 feet and note that the question is being asked everywhere. And the convention, and at least one part of the conventional wisdom, is that the advent of what is called advanced robotics, the advent of what is called artificial intelligence, probably a misnomer used by us laymen, but that's how the public debate has been conducted so far. Those two technologies in particular are so revolutionary that we are going to see the kind of job destruction due to them that we've never seen in previous waves of technology and automation. And before getting into the question of whether the effects will be negative or positive, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what precisely those terms mean and even if they're what we should be talking about.
Yeah, so you know, the rise of the robots and the challenge of artificial intelligence are pretty current in the policy debate, and even beyond. People are concerned about what jobs their kids are going to have. But I think that they're too narrow for our purposes, partly because they haven't happened yet. We've seen some automation in manufacturing. We've seen quite a lot of manufacturing automation, and we've seen quite a lot of jobs moving away from manufacturing as a result. So that's a clue. But you know, when I talk to people about it, they ask when the robot is going to take my job. And it's not quite as simple as that. If you think about your job is a bundle of tasks. And what will happen is not that there will be Mr. Robot sitting at your desk one day instead of you. What will happen is that some of those tasks will be done by machines. And they probably will not be physical machines either. They will be software. Mark Andreessen said many years ago, software is eating the world.
And just let's make sure to identify him. He was the founder of the
Netscape,
browser Netscape that was a major step forward. And he's now
a pretty well-known venture capitalist.
And the technology guru.
Yes.
Right, okay.
He's not always right, but that was a deep insight.
Okay,
that the changes in information technology have allowed us to do things that we simply couldn't imagine 10 years ago. You know, 10 years ago, the driverless car was a case study in people's work on what could not be automated.
Right.
Driving was impossible. You couldn't get to a driverless car.
Right.
Well, 10 years on, we got driverless
Seems
cars.
to be a lot closer.
Yes,
certainly.
right.
Yes.
So my point is general, that you have to think not about robots replacing people, but tasks and jobs getting unbundled. So let me give you an example which people don't usually think about. Doctors. What do doctors do? Right? Doctors diagnose, they treat, they say nice things to their patient.
If they have a good bedside manner.
If they have a good bedside manner. I think in 10 years, it's extremely unlikely that doctors are going to be doing diagnosis. Doctors cannot possibly keep up with the literature. They are heavily influenced by the marketing of big pharma.
Right.
And they make mistakes.
Sure.
And if you have, I don't say that machines will never make mistakes, but they'll make fewer.
Yeah.
So 10 years from now, the job of a doctor is going to look really, really different. If they're not the primary diagnostician, what does that say? It's not that they will all go away. It's just that they will either do something else, and possibly that a number of them will go away.
Right.
So I guess my sort of general point is, we have to think of these technologies first, that these technologies are much broader than just AI and robotics. Those are kind of the spearhead points in manufacturing and elsewhere. They will make a difference over the next 10 years. But Amazon is already eating jobs. It's not that we have to wait for AI. Amazon will take an enormous number of retail jobs if there is no AI. They don't need it. It's a different set of things. So we have the advent of digital platforms, which are an entirely new beast. We have a global economy. We have companies that operate in a different kind of way now. And those are all things that contribute to this. So it's not just about the technology, it's about the whole package.
It seems, though, that it's been a relatively recent phenomenon that a main focus of politicians and the chattering classes, the pundits, the talk show people, etc. It seems only fairly recently that they have been concentrating on this alleged jobs-eating likelihood of these new technologies, even though A lot of them have been around for quite a while. We had robots being introduced into General Motors factories and actually into Japanese automobile factories decades ago.
30 years ago.
We've had software is not new. Obviously, it's become much more sophisticated. But why do you suppose that there's been this new outburst or this recent outburst?
Well, it seems
of concern.
Yeah. It seems to me that there's a confluence of factors. First off, the speed of technological change is accelerating. You know, people who are not worried about the disruption that I see ahead, people who aren't worried basically point to the past. And they say, well, we managed to move from agriculture to manufacturing, manufacturing to services. It was a bit disruptive, but in the end, everyone did better. But those took decades and decades, and it was harsh anyway. And we know from the Rust Belt that, you know, adjustment can be really, really painful. But this is much faster. You know, it took about 75 years for cars to reach 50% of the population. And it took 7 years for smartphones to reach 50% of the population. It's just much faster. So that's point one. Point two is that we are now the US used to be a continental economy which it could control. You know, we could have labor laws, we could have intellectual property laws, and while there would be arguments and complaints, we controlled that. We've gone from 10% of our economy being imports and exports only 30 years ago, less than 30 years ago. Now it's 30%. So we are embedded in a global economy, like it or not. We have to worry about labor markets in China and intellectual property in China in ways that we simply didn't. So we have less control. The third is what I call scope. So if you think about it, the transition from agriculture to manufacturing affected basically one industry, agriculture. There are different components. The shift from manufacturing to services, yes, there are different manufacturing industries, obviously, but it's like 15% of the economy, 18%, 20% of the economy. It's not big, important, but what I'm saying is that the transformation we're seeing affects everybody. It affects government services, it affects healthcare, it affects manufacturing, it affects financial services, it affects teaching, and it affects retail. All of the services. So in a certain sense, everybody feels uneasy because everybody knows that they could be next. So those three things, I think, come together to make people very concerned, uneasy. It's too fast, we don't know how to handle it. There are some other things which we can talk about later if you want, about how we're poorly positioned to handle it. And we may be worse off than we used to be. But I think that's why people are worried. They see something happening very quickly, very deeply, very widely, and they don't really know what to do about it.
I would imagine also, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the advent of the global financial crisis, this painful recession that followed, this weak recovery that's followed it, which has been characterized to a remarkable extent by very feeble wages growth, must have had something to do with this, with a feeding into a growing sense of insecurity about one's financial future.
Yes, I think you put your finger on something important. I think this notion of insecurity is an important one. The Brits have a term for this. They call it the precariat. The people who are precariously connected to the labor market. And you know, there are 60 million Americans out of 180 in the workforce, more or less, who are in some kind of contingent relationship. They're not in a full-time job. And so, and people can see that those full-time jobs are gradually being replaced by contracting and gig economy, and you know, and they look and they see that their hold on their own job is just not secure. It used to be that you would go into government, for example, and you know, it's a job for life. I mean, you could screw up, but it was very difficult. It was a job for life. Well, I don't think people think like that anymore. And so there is this tension underneath. And I would say it's also a tension with the American dream. you know, the social contract after World War II was a contract that said, you work hard, you pay your taxes, you pay your dues, and you'll be taken care of, and your kids will do better than you. I think basically in the last 20 years we've broken that contract.
It's certainly frayed very badly at the very least.
So. Yeah, so people are upset. And they're upset partly because they can't really tell what's going on. They can't see the future because the future is so cloudy and difficult to see. And the sort of underlying terms of the deal seem to have been renegotiated without anybody telling them.
Right. Let's get back to this subject of the so-called gig economy just for a moment, because we admittedly don't have wonderful ways of measuring it. It's hard to quantify precisely, but I think everybody would agree it's been growing rapidly, and certainly more rapidly than most other kinds. In fact, than the more desirable forms of full-time employment. But is there a close connection, as you see it, between the spread of this gig economy and these new technology trends that are sweeping through the workplace? Because I can see arguments both for and against that proposition.
Well, one of the things I'd say first is that the Uber is not the gig economy.
Okay,
Uber is a small part. I mentioned 60 million people who have some kind of contingent relationship to the workforce. They might be contractors, they might be part-time workers. You know, there are a lot of different kinds of arrangements. Uber only has 150,000 people. It's barely a pinprick on the boil of the of the contingent economy. But it's facilitated by the technology. You couldn't have Uber without the technology. And similarly, I think contracting and outsourcing has become much more feasible. It used to be that you had to work on site, really, to get anything done. I mean, teleworking was rare, and outsourcing was rare. And now it's not. It's just one more option in front of the manager, one more menu item, if you like. You might hire somebody in. Well, hiring somebody in is expensive. It's difficult to find the right people. We can talk about that later. And you have all these benefits and other costs. And then you might have to fire them. And so in many countries, that's difficult. So all in all, there are advantages to having a contractor. Even if you don't control them as well, there are disadvantages as well. But the technology facilitates it, makes it really relatively straightforward. So I think the technology has made it easier to piece out work in different ways.
One development that I've also found fascinating is that the growth of contingent work and part-time work and these less secure jobs has by no means been confined to the United States. And I've read, maybe only superficially, but I have read that in places like Britain and even Germany, which so many progressives, at least in this country, view as the model job market, they've done everything right, they have high-wage jobs, that there, in particular, German industry has begun relying very heavily on part-time work.
And immigrants.
You
know, so there's a certain amount of truth to that. It's actually, I think, less so in Germany and a bit more in England. But I would also point to something interesting, which is not quite the gig economy. The Brits have been going through a lot of policy discussion and public anger about what they call 0 hours contracts. These are actually standard American contracts for many places like McDonald's. These are contracts where a company hires you and they say, all right, we'll pay you $12 an hour or $7 an hour, depending on where they are. We're not going to guarantee you any number of hours. We will just sign you up and we'll tell you this week how many hours you're going to work. So it's basically putting all the risk of the work onto the worker with no stability. So workers find themselves committed to being at McDonald's, even if McDonald's has no hours for them. And the Brits I think, either have or are certainly considering legislation to make this illegal, because it has tilted, it demonstrates that the balance of power has tilted massively to the company away from unskilled workers.
Yes.
And it is deeply unfair, and it is very difficult to manage your life. I mean, imagine having to deal with childcare, right? If you don't know if you're going to be paid, you don't know when you're going to work, it's almost impossible. And you can't piece together a full-time job from multiple sources, because they all say you have to be on call. If you're not on call, they'll fire you.
That's right.
And so this could be an issue that eventually reaches America. It'll be late, because it's, there are more, it's more in line with labor concerns in Europe. But it's a characteristic of the gig economy that all of the uncertainty and risk is on the side of the worker. And I think that, as people experience more and more of that, look, the gig economy has one great thing. You control your hours. That's a fantastic thing. I love it. I've worked in the gig economy
if there's
myself
an abundance of hours.
Yeah, so there are people, high-paid people, for whom the gig economy is a wonderful fit. It's not so much for so many other people. They do it because they have to.
Exactly. Is it possible to generalize, or is it useful to generalize about whether the new technologies are likelier to affect lower wage, low skill workers, or higher wage, higher skill workers more?
I could make three different arguments.
Okay.
The argument at the low end of the scale is that what people do is easy to automate.
Right? I mean, there are machines now that are being built to flip burgers. They flip 2,000 burgers a day. No problem. They never get sick. They don't get injured. They don't fail to show up. So if you have something that's really simple to do, well, that's pretty easy to automate. You go to the top end, to the doctor, it's pretty hard to automate, but it's really worth it. What they charge is a lot. So if you can figure out a way of automating a slice of a high-paid job, that's really worth doing. So that's going to happen too. We've seen that with lawyers, for example. Look at the way that software has eliminated discovery as a lucrative function for lawyers.
So software has started killing all the lawyers.
It has, because, like other service businesses, lawyers work with a kind of complex tripod of revenue streams, and they have their own hours, then they bill out their associates at ridiculous wages. I mean, not wages, certainly not wages, but costs. Well, if you take away one leg of the stool, it's pretty uncomfortable sitting on it. And we found that, that aside from the top end of the legal profession, there's a lot of stress. One level down, there's a lot of stress. And it's partly because one big chunk of how they made money just got wiped out. So that's the top end. Well, then you've got the middle. But it's harder to say what's happening in the middle. There's a lot of management in there. All one can do is look at the wage data and the payroll data, and what you see is that the middle is hollowing out. Those jobs are really gradually being eliminated. I have my own theory of how this relates to productivity, which we can. Okay. Well, this is my Dilbert theory of productivity gains. Just to back up for a second, critics of my sort of automation and disruption hypothesis just point to the productivity data, and they say, well, productivity is low. It can't be. Not much can be going on.
Just to inject one specific data point in here, because I've been taking a look lately at the new productivity numbers that the U.S. government has put out, and we see that, in particular, according to the broadest measure we have, the so-called multi-factor productivity, the growth slowdown between the previous economic recovery during the so-called bubble decade, during which it's clear that the American economy was not nearly as healthy as it looked on the surface. The slowdown between that expansion and the productivity growth of the current expansion has been dramatic.
You know, you raise a good point. Productivity appears to be down. And this is a problem for my argument, because I'm arguing that we're about to be overwhelmed by the
productivity enhancing things.
But yes. Well, I think it's good to think about the productivity paradox as having two sets of explanations. One set is mainstream economics, and this is where most economists come out. Sort of famously, Tyler Cowen and Robert Gordon have argued that we are in a period of basically secular stagnation, that the productivity is just down. And then the problem is to explain why in this kind of apparently innovative period, point backwards and say, well, electricity was much more important, and the current technology is just not that important and isn't having that. And so that's one set of explanations. The other set is really from what I call heretics. The productivity heretics who say, well, actually, the data are increasingly bad. And they're bad for a variety of reasons. One can, productivity data do a very poor job of dealing with new technologies.
And to be fair, most economists, even those who
are mainstream, will agree with that.
Would agree that measuring productivity is one of the hardest things that they do, and one of the areas in which they have the least confidence in their work.
Well, if that was the case, in reality, then maybe you can explain why they get hysterical because it's fallen from 2% to 1.8%. Right?
Well,
it's fallen by more than that.
If you look at it recovery to recovery, the growth rate has been cut in half.
But this time is different.
Well, maybe.
This time is different. So I believe we are seeing accelerating innovation, which productivity data is very poor at handling. They're good at handling shifts in the output of the same thing.
Right. Okay.
That's easy to measure. Hard to measure outputs of different things. Right. They're very poor at measuring quality changes. So, you know, I have my cell phone to take pictures. My pictures are better than the camera I used to have, which I no longer carry. GNP has gone down because the camera is no longer there, but my pictures are better and I can share them with anybody.
Maybe we need some more hurricanes to boost GNP for rebuilding.
Exactly. They're also very bad at measuring the informal economy, which by definition is out of scope. We can see the informal economy is growing. So some productivity is going there, but it's not measured. And then there are a number of other features of this. I personally like my own Dilbert explanation of this. So if you're working in an office, and you're a white-collar worker, and gradually your productivity improves because software gets better, processes get better. So what happens? Do you do more work? No. Do you get fired? No. You spend more time watching Netflix and shopping and doing Facebook and watching porn and you know, in your office. And what's happening is that the white-collar workers are actually reappropriating the productivity gains. They take it. The company doesn't get it. It just happens. They just sit there, they do their work, it takes less and less time. And then you have a crash, like the Great Recession. Bunch of people get fired, you reset back down to where you were, because now you may notice output doesn't fall. So that implies that there was a lot of hidden productivity somewhere that wasn't being fully accounted for.
And it was being appropriated by the workers in the form of more leisure time, essentially, at work.
Exactly. There's plenty of survey data to back this up. That is what's happening.
And if we read Dilbert every week, we see that is the dominant feature of that company, right?
And it strikes a note, doesn't it?
Absolutely it does.
It does. So you know, I put that as the Dilbert theory of productivity. Anyway, so my sort of general point is, I think that productivity is actually growing much faster than we think it is and can measure.
Now let's try to link the advent of these new technologies to another big policy debate that we're having in this country and also Europe, and that's over immigration.
Yeah.
If we are on the cusp of an age when technology will become a significant net job destroyer, do we want to maintain the same kinds of quantitative immigration policies that we have, essentially letting in about 1 million workers legally each year, some through family unification, some through an explicit search for job skills? Do those two strategies mix very well? It would seem to me there are some important contradictions there.
I think there are contradictions. I mean, it's interesting. As a sort of student of the labor movement, it's fascinating to see where the labor movement has gone on this. The labor movement used to be vigorously anti-immigrant because they wanted to defend existing jobs and existing workers. And we've now shifted so that I think there is a contradiction. The Democratic Party is now pretty strongly pro-immigrant, and not just pretty strongly pro-immigrant for immigrants who are here, which I personally would support. I know that we might have some differences about that. But it's hard. I think many Democrats are pretty careful not to think too hard about where to draw the line. Looking at what I've found, I think it's clear that there are certain jobs where immigration really does affect the labor market. And the two that I would point out are diametrically opposed ends of the labor spectrum. One is computer programmers, where I think Microsoft and the other high-tech companies basically have ruthlessly exploited the H-1B visa program in order to keep wages down.
And once again, just for those who are not familiar with it, it's a special visa program that lets in a certain number of workers who ostensibly have got extraordinary skills that, or extraordinarily specialized skills that are urgently needed by specific employers.
Yes, and you know, when I talk to my my pro-innovation friends, and I am pro-innovation, but they say, well, you know, you just need to teach people to code, and well, the wages of coders have not changed, and they haven't changed in part because the supply is affected by H-1B. So at the other end of the spectrum, among cashiers, that cashiers work in a labor market where the impact of Hispanic immigrants has been significant. Hispanic cashier, the share of cashiers who are Hispanic is up from 10% to 25%. The traditional cashier population has also suffered, incidentally, by an influx of men. Used to be a very, very female job, and now, as men have been pushed out of better jobs in manufacturing, they are now becoming cashiers. And the result is real wages have been falling.
What a surprise.
What a surprise. Apparently not falling fast enough because we're looking at automating them out of a job anyway. But so I do take your point that, and I guess what I would say is, the way to think about immigration is, if there are true labor shortages, well, as a short-term policy, one might very well want to allow immigration. One might want to allow refugees for other reasons. We might want to deal with families differently. But just from a labor market perspective, one has to be realistic that adding labor to a market means that there's more supply, and hence that you tend to get lower wages. And I don't think that's a positive thing for the labor market generally. We can come back to that later.
Let's get a little futuristic here, okay?
Okay.
One of the main worries that I keep reading about, hopefully my reading is representative of the general public discussion, is that these new technologies have such extraordinary potential to replace labor that in the foreseeable future, and of course people disagree about how quickly this will come, in the foreseeable future, we're going to be living in a society where there's just not a lot of work to be done, generally speaking.
Right.
And even folks who are highly qualified for the current job market are simply not going to be able to find work. And spinning this forward perhaps a little bit further, there seems to be a lot of anxiety about the possibility of a future where many of us are not going to be able to define ourselves by our jobs because there just won't be enough work to go around.
So this is an important, really deep point. One would have to say that if that was the case, it would not be because we as a society have become less wealthy. On the contrary, it would be because we've become more wealthy as more productive technologies have replaced humans, right?
Right.
So you have to differentiate between what I would call the material characteristics of a job and the personal or satisfying characteristics of a job. The material side we will eventually have to deal with. I mean, one can see futures ranging from sort of terrible dystopias where packs of semi-feral people are roaming the earth in between gated communities of rich people. You know, that's a horrifying vision.
Go to South Florida.
You have to remember that if we have all this replacement of labor, we're going to end up with a bigger pie. We must do.
We'll be a much wealthier society.
We'll be a wealthier society. We may end up with you know, packs of feral humans scrabbling around outside the gated communities of possibly of South Florida, but
possibly today.
Yes, possibly today. So we have to solve a redistribution problem on the material side, and there are experiments out there in basic income, and there are others in terms of guaranteed work, for example. One of the interesting things about how this works together, if you have a guaranteed income, you don't need to pay people a minimum wage. They have a minimum, you know, I have lots of things on my house that I would like to pay somebody $1 an hour to do, which they might enjoy doing. They might, I mean, there are parts that they might not. But so if you don't have a minimum wage, you have a more flexible set of jobs. There's more that you can imagine people doing. And so on the material side, it's partly just we have to have a political circumstance that allows us to fix it. And it's going to be difficult, and the transition is going to be especially difficult. What do you do when some people are working full-time and other people have a guaranteed income? That is going to be tricky.
That's a formula for some real social and political division.
Yes, yes it is. But let's turn to the non-material side. I agree with you. People get a sense of self-worth. In fact, one could argue that the story of capitalism is about how more and more of their self-worth is bound up in their job.
Absolutely.
You know, when you go and it's true perhaps especially in America. I think here you would go to a party and you'd ask somebody what they do. And other places you might ask, where are you from? What, you know, what soccer team do you support? I mean,
how about that great concert last week?
Exactly. So we've really sort of, you know, internalized that very deeply, and if you take that away from people, one can see that it would be challenging. But there are models. We have a big retired community, and most of those retired people, A, enjoy retirement, and B, do a lot. They travel, they work in the community, they see their kids. You know, there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of learning going on, lifelong learning and education. So, and one could imagine opportunities for more connected communities if you had more time and you know, I think we're going to have to figure out how to take care of old people. This is becoming more important as I get older. There's plenty of opportunities for things to do. I think the question is, will people be motivated without a job? The evidence is fairly good that yeah, I think they will be. So I'm less concerned about that. I think we will find a way, and actually what we'll find is many different ways.
It'll be interesting to see if enough people are motivated to spend their time usefully and constructively so that you have a continuing and ongoing improvement of the level of civilization, as opposed to a world full of slackers who are playing video games and not much else.
Well, this is the, this is the classic division between conservatives and liberals, isn't it?
Right,
so,
right.
Liberals are optimists and conservatives are pessimists, and we'll see how it turns out.
We'll see it played out. Now, clearly, as we've been indicating throughout the discussion, this, however slowly or quickly or completely or partly one sees these new technologies spreading and affecting the workforce. Clearly, there's a series of policy challenges that will be facing governments.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if, before we start to deal with how the United States government has been handling this or not handling this, are there other countries whose governments you feel are at this point doing an especially good job or an especially poor job?
So I'd like to point to Germany.
Okay.
For two reasons, because I think two of the things that they do will matter to us. The first is the notion of a works council and of a supervisory board for large companies that includes stakeholders, not just shareholders.
Right.
I think this is something we have to move towards.
Meaning workers.
Meaning workers, organized, line workers.
Right.
But also the local state. Often the local state has a significant stake in company governance.
Right.
We have allowed ourselves to be swept away by the notion that the only thing a company is for is to take care of its shareholders.
Right.
Well, and its top executives who intervene to ensure that their pockets are well lined. This just seems to be nonsense to me. I mean, to the extent that we allow corporations to incorporate in our country and work in our communities, we need to impose responsibilities.
Well, certainly the expected spin-offs that conservatives, in particular free market folks, typically promise will result spontaneously from the shareholder capitalism model, more job-creating investment, more efficient use of resources, a more productive economy, kind of haven't been happening.
Well, they may be happening, but not necessarily here.
That's true too, exactly.
And not necessarily, and not necessarily in the communities where they are now.
Right.
We've had, yes, it's true that there's been a lot of investment in the U.S. It's been driving a huge shift of production from the north to the south, where conditions are easier for companies, wages are lower, regulation is less.
Lighter, right.
We are sort of using the states to fuel a race to the bottom.
Absolutely.
But they move abroad too.
Yes, they do.
So I guess my view is that we should be encouraging policies that treat companies as American to the extent that they are American, which is that they have jobs here and wages here and payroll here. That's it.
And certainly you do benefit greatly from incorporating here, from doing business here. And it would seem that at least some form of pay-go would be highly justified.
Yes. So that's one. And the other thing that the Germans do perhaps better than anybody else is their apprenticeship system.
Okay.
So we have a population that even today, coming into the workforce now, only a third of our kids have a BA, a college degree, a bachelor's degree. 1/3. 1/3 have no more than high school.
Right.
This is the knowledge economy.
Right.
We have big problems here.
Sure.
We need to be able to figure out ways to incorporate the non-college educated people into our economy in much more efficient ways. And I think the apprenticeship program is one. I was also very disappointed with the Obama administration. I felt that their steps to support community colleges were timid and insufficient. They need to be driving this. That's where the value is. It's not, you know, yes, we need our great universities and our colleges. Yes, I'm not saying take it away from them, but we need to be investing in the 2/3 of the population who are not going to college.
Right. Right.
And that's what the Germans do.
Exactly. Now, let's turn to the United States. You just expressed a disappointment in the previous president. The current president hasn't been in office that long.
Right.
So maybe not yet appropriate to draw any solid conclusions. But here we have a federal system where the states are supposed to be laboratories of democracy, where you have had some continuity. Are there any states or regions that you can point to as having forward-looking strategies here? I certainly hope so.
Yeah, no, I can. I would say that some of the Rust Belt states have really worked hard. I think Ohio has made really substantial investments in trying to rebuild its economy. If you look at places like Pittsburgh, where a Rust Belt city has reinvented itself as a university and medical complex. That's pretty impressive. But even in places like Akron, you know, the University of Akron has
very entrepreneurial,
very active. So it's possible to look. It's hard to grow innovative companies. It's just hard. You need a complete ecosystem to help it happen on a consistent basis and make it grow. So I would say that, and I would say that the states that have invested the most in education have probably done best. You know, that so far that's what's panned out best.
One national trend that seems to be pretty deeply rooted and that seems destined to continue has been labor market mismatches, and you see it in part anyway in the monthly government data on job openings, where even in sectors like manufacturing, where there's supposed to be no long-term future in gainful employment, whatever, you see hundreds of thousands of jobs that this is a situation reported by the manufacturers themselves, but let's assume that they're being honest, and they do need 300,000 workers each month that they claim they can't find.
So there's two things. Two points I'd make about that. One is that it used to be that manufacturing companies trained their own workers. You know, when Henry Ford started his production line, there was nobody who knew how to to work on a production line.
Because they didn't exist before.
When I was visiting Ohio, I spoke to somebody at Honda, and he was looking for people who could operated a computer-driven cutting tool. And so I talked to him. I said, okay, well, how many people do you want? And he said, oh, about 12. I'm looking hard. I can't find them. And I said, well, why don't you just train them? And he said, oh, we don't do that. You know, so this is part of that sort of shift to shareholder value, right? It's part of not seeing that you have a long-term stake in what you're doing. So I guess that's one point. The other point I would make is that we're seeing the negative consequences of online recruitment. So if you want a job now, really, you have to apply online. It's almost impossible to find a job that you can apply for in person. You have
Pounding the pavement is
right. So you pound the computer instead. So what's happened? People post a job. They used to get the 10 people who were prepared to walk in and fill in an application. You now get 5,000 applications. If you've ever seen a job call for a fast food restaurant, it's absolutely astounding.
It is.
I passed one a week or so ago up in Wheaton in my area. Lines around the block to sign up for new Roy Rogers. Absolutely astounding. So you're manufacturing, you get 5,000 people, right? So how do you sort them? Do you look at the qualifications of each one? This is impossible. You don't have the time. So what do? You say, well, let's start with all the ones who have a BA. Right? So jobs which which don't require a BA,
By no means.
and where the people who working the job don't have a BA,
Right.
nonetheless require that the next applicant have one. So we have this credential creep,
Sure, right.
and it's substantial. And it makes it, so what we're doing is bifurcating the labor market as a direct result of this technology.
Yeah. That's
And
a
I
good
don't
point.
really blame the manufacturer because they're kind of stuck.
They're swamped.
They're swamped.
Right, right.
So what do you do? How do you do this? How do you filter people?
Yeah.
It's very difficult.
There also seems to be an emerging, and perhaps for quite a while, geographic mismatch.
Yes.
It seems that
Yeah.
many of the jobs that are available for so-called mid-skilled people are increasingly not in areas where a
Right.
lot of the mid-skilled people live.
Right.
And moving is hard because of housing prices. And
Well,
things
not
of
just
that.
housing. I think it's interesting that the rate of movement
Yeah.
used to be that about 20% of Americans moved every year.
Right,
That was in the early 80s, not so long ago.
Right, yeah.
Now it's 11%.
That's a big drop.
It's a huge drop, and it's partly housing,
Right.
because the jobs are in places where the housing is expensive.
Yeah, sure.
But I think, the right wing would say, well, it's all these social services and benefits so that, people are tied to their location, they don't want to lose their benefits, and they can afford to not work.
Yeah.
So there's probably some truth to that. But one can also think of it more positively. People are not just economic actors. They live embedded in a community, and it's a community of support.
Sure.
This is where their family is. They know, the definition of a family is where they have to take you in.
Yes, that's right.
Right? Yeah. So this is a place where you're safe in a certain sense in a very difficult, uncertain world.
Right.
Moving to New York or to San Francisco is a huge gamble.
It's a daunting proposition. It really
Yes,
is,
and
yeah.
given that, according to the feds, more than 50% of Americans would find it impossible to pay a sudden bill of $400,
Right, right.
where are they going to get the money to
Sure,
move?
sure. How does that happen?
How does that happen? It's not
doesn't.
like the Jodes where you pack up your
Right,
truck and everything. And
Which was a pretty daunting venture itself.
it was
but,
indeed, and it was driven by absolute desperation.
Absolutely right.
But one can imagine kind of doing that in those days. It was still go west, young man, right?
Exactly. Sure.
Well,
sure.
not now.
Sure.
You go west and you have to sleep on the streets.
Yeah. And so, Robin, finally, let's bring this conversation to a close by asking you, generally speaking, realizing that we all have fairly cloudy crystal balls, are you relatively optimistic about American society's ability to handle this transition in a reasonably smooth way, or are you not so optimistic?
Wow. So I have to say that I am an immense technological optimist. I hear that we're all going to run out of water in 2050, and we're going to run out of energy, and we're going to run out of this and run out of that. I don't believe that. I believe that we will solve our climate issues. I believe we will solve our water and our pesticide issues and others. I know that there are reasons to believe that it's going to be difficult, but I really believe that we are on the cusp of a period of incredible bounty in a technological sense. I am fairly pessimistic about how well we will handle that because the evidence from the last 30 years is not so good. Right. What we've seen, and even in the last year, so in the last 30 years, we've seen an incredible growth in the wealth of the top 10%. Absolutely staggering. But it wasn't enough, right? It wasn't enough to be incredibly rich. One had to become yet richer by imposing a massive tax on our grandchildren. And that doesn't fill me with optimism that we have a dominant elite that sees only its own in short-term interests and benefits.
And that's never a formula for social or national success, at least not over any significant
stretch
of time.
And one could argue that all of these, elites have never been especially good at seeing beyond the end of their nose.
Or sharing.
Not
at the sharing.
Sharing and vision are not their strongest characteristics. So if you look back through social history, you find that periods of very strong populist and labor organization and ferment have led to major improvements and new social contracts.
Right.
We had one after the war, we had one in Britain in the 1850s, another one in the early 20th century. So these periods of crisis and conflict in the end have worked out well for the elites, though they didn't think so at the time. And maybe I think it's almost certain that we will need another one, but it's going to be harder because technology and globalization have tilted the playing field so that the power of the elites to protect themselves is much stronger than it ever was.
Sure.
They don't care. They don't have to care what happens here.
Exactly. Exactly.
They may, but they don't have to.
Right. Well, it's not my natural inclination to end discussions like this on a relatively somber note, but perhaps realism is the first step toward finding new solutions that actually will be constructive.
If you don't think it's a problem, you're not going to solve it.
Exactly. If it ain't broke, you're not going to want to fix it.
That's right.
So Robin, again, thank you so much for your time.
Been great.
We really appreciate your insights. And we will, first of all, how can people find you online?
They can find my company at Incumetrics.com, and they can find my work in this area at GreatDisruption2018.com.
How aptly named.
Yes.
And again, thank you so much. We will look forward to following your work. And thank you, everybody, for listening to this month's Smart Talk.